Okay, Gregory Bateson was actually an anthropologist. He wasn't even a psychiatrist at all, he was an anthropologist, and he came up with this great, it's called the double-bind theory of schizophrenia, and it describes a very common psychiatric phenomena, but instead of going through the reality tunnel of mainstream modern Western medicine, which tries to apply its view of the body and its view of the mind, that the issues must be either, due to genetic deformity or fault, or some kind of a virus, which that's where all problems in the body derive from. Except, however, you can't suggest that psychiatric illnesses are picked up like viruses, because that would make you insane, wouldn't it, if you suggested that? So they tend to assume that it comes from either from trauma or from genetics, and the problem is biochemical, and therefore the solution is biochemical. So I love this, Gregory Bateson's double-bind theory of schizophrenia, not just because it takes us away from a more classically medical psychiatric view of a psychological phenomena, but because it describes a psychological phenomena and a psychological illness in terms of learning, and in an organic way, and in terms of how the environment can actually drive somebody insane, how a psychological environment can actually drive somebody insane. So let me very quickly break down what the four major components of a true Bateson double bind are. This is useful, by the way, for people who are also interested in protecting themselves from the ill effects of propaganda and advertising, and people who think or suspect that they might be in relationships with narcissists, because narcissists are experts at putting people in double binds, as are propagandists, as are politicians. The four components of Bateson's double bind scenario are that it must involve two or more people, and that one person will be decreed to be the victim. The second thing is that it is repeated. It's a repeated effect. It's not a single trauma. It's a traumatic event that is played out again and again and again to drive the person slowly insane and to wear them down. The third thing is that there must be a primary injunction, and the primary injunction, must be somebody telling you to do something at the risk of pain or death. So it's do this or I'll hurt you, or don't do that or I will hurt you. So the consequences must be severe. Fourthly, there needs to be a secondary injunction that directly contradicts the primary injunction, but at a higher level and more abstract way, and it doesn't necessarily need to be via explicit verbal content. Now, I know all this sounds quite complicated, but bear with me, because it's well worth grasping an understanding of this, because once you've got your head around this, you'll find out that you have actually been put in, if you've ever been emotionally manipulated, you've probably been put in a double bind of some kind at some point in your life. Another element of this is that Bateson says behind all the four different levels of the requirements of a true double bind scenario is that the perpetrator must have a relationship with the victim that is considered to be vital. Vital, vitae, Latin for life, as in almost that the person who is in control almost has a life-threatening position of authority over the victim. So two very simple and clear-cut examples of where we see this, and the context in which Bateson was talking about this was in families. And he said basically the schizophrenic in a family unit is the weakest link, who is kind of scapegoated, as it were. So the family unit, what he was suggesting, the family unit can be mentally ill and sick, but the symptoms might only present themselves in one person, and this one person will be the one person who is perhaps more sensitive, more attuned, more socially intelligent, and they bear the burden of everybody else's neurosis and mental illness because they're being scapegoated. And basically it drives the individual, the child, insane. Where it's more easily understood is in the example I like to give is in a fictional context of the book and the film, which has been made into a couple of good films, 1984, which is where a political prisoner is being tortured. And the double bind works like this. You have the interrogator, the torturer, who calls himself an educator. He doesn't call himself a torturer. He will say, this is for your good. This is because your mind is poisoned. The original root of we have this word that in modern usage of brainwashing, and where that actually came from is from a Chinese term that was called heart washing. And it was to do with the idea that, if you had thoughts that were against the party, then you were sick, and you needed those thoughts needed to be grasped by the root and ripped out of you. That's where we get the idea of brainwashing from. So where do we see Gregory Bateson's four requirements for the double bind in 1984? You have a victim and you have the perpetrator of the double bind. Yes, you have Winston, the main character. He's strapped to a table and he's either being electrocuted or racked, but he's life or death. The perpetrator has a life or death control over him, as an abuser does with a child, because in a child's eyes a parent is the source of shelter and food in that child's world, and so therefore the parent is effectively a god. The second thing is the repetition. The second requirement for a double bind that we see in 1984 is the repetition. The main character, Winston, is kidnapped and he's told he's been tortured over a 7-week period. He's been beaten daily, he's malnourished, he's become very, very thin. He's so malnourished that, even his teeth are falling out. The third condition, 3, is that he be given a primary injunction. And the primary injunction is, tell me how many fingers I'm holding up. And if you lie or you try and trip me, then you'll experience massive pain. This guy is strapped to the table. There's the torturer, the interrogator, has total control over how much pain he experiences. He has total control over life and death, whether he lives or dies. And he says to Winston, how many fingers am I holding up? And don't lie to me. That's the primary injunction. And Winston looks and he says, you're holding up 3 fingers. And he's punished for that. He's tortured. So the interrogator turns to somebody and says, give him 3,000 volts or whatever, experiences a massive amount of pain. And he says to him again, how many fingers am I holding up? And he says, 3, you're holding up 3 fingers. And he says, I told you not to lie to me. Give him another shot. Now this goes on and on and on, and I'm sure you can imagine, if you put yourself in that scenario, how many times would you let that happen before you would say, what do you want me to say? What is it that you want me to say? The secondary injunction is that you must not lie. However, he's not lying, he's telling the truth, and he's being punished for both. He's being punished for seeing reality as it is, and he's being punished for stating what the other person doesn't want him to hear. When Winston actually challenges this and says, you're confusing me, I don't know what you want, what is it that you want from me? He's even punished for that. And that's another layer of the level of Bateson's double bind theory of schizophrenia, is that if the victim actually calls the perpetrator out and says, you're being crazy, what you're asking me to do doesn't make sense, they're even punished for that. So every single option of response that they have equals pain. It's like one of those, it's like a twisted version of what those crazy psychologists used to do with rats in a maze, where they would go left and you get a piece of cheese, go right and you get an electric shock. This is a twisted version where it's like, sorry Mr. Rat, but every fucking option you could take is going to be painful. What would happen under those circumstances? Well, I've seen animals in extreme levels of captivity where every option they have is painful. I went to a zoo in Spain when I was about 10. I don't know what the laws were, but these animals were not being kept. I don't agree with zoos, full stop. I don't think it's a natural environment for an animal to be in, but these animals were clearly suffering. Some of them had gone basically catatonic. and some of them were actually banging their heads and stuff. The one that stuck with me the most was a fox. They actually had a fox in a cage, and the fox had like a seat. Obviously there wasn't a fox chair there. Had a seat, and it was jumping down and jumping back up in a circle, round and round. Presumably it would just carry on doing that until it died of exhaustion. So when every option is painful, you're creating a huge amount of anguish for the person. So we've got two people, repeated exposure to trauma, primary injunction and secondary injunction, and both the primary injunction and the secondary injunction are in conflict, and both things lead to pain. And surrounding that is this relationship in which I have total control over life and death, and your pain or not pain, and if you challenge me, I will torture you, I will hurt you for challenging me. So where do we see that? So the 1984 example, if you can go and look that scene up, it's a really great example of a double bind. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't, and you're damned if you say, I'm damned if I do and I'm damned if I don't. Right? So you can't actually just sit there and throw your hands up and go, oh, fucking hell, Mr. Torturer, you're being a bit of a prick here, because then you're going to get tortured even more. Where does this work with kids? With Gregory Bateson's double bind theory, where it applied to schizophrenia, how it would manifest in children was where abusers would say things like, a very simple example, if I say, you know that I fucking love you, don't you? You know that I love you. And the words are, hey, I love you. You know, the content is I love you, but if I fucking love you, the meta communication is aggression. The meta communication through the tone of voice, the posturing, the energy, the facial expression is one of aggression. So then the child has to deal with two conflicting levels of communication. In this context, that body language, that contextual level of communication is what we call meta communication. So when the direct content, explicit communication, I love you, is conflicted by the meta communication, which is I fucking love you, which is expressed in an angry way or a frustrated way or whatever it is, then you have a conflict. Now, because the child needs a parent's love, it's a vital need. Food and shelter are great, but the children also need love and attention. The child will start to learn to misinterpret external reality. You know, even though it sounds like my parent is angry with me, he's telling me he loves me, I need him to love me, so I'm going to choose to believe that. And what can happen is you end up with people who've had such abusive relationships with parents, or you know, maybe not even with parents, maybe they've actually been directly abused, is that they learn to misinterpret miscommunication, and they learn to misinterpret reality, and they become what we call schizophrenic. There's certain types of schizophrenia that is commonly observed in, I remember I read a paper about this years ago, amongst people who've been adopted, and in my experience, I've actually repeatedly had the experience of meeting people who have been adopted, who, not always, but some, consistently struggle with meta-communication. They don't deal with jokes very well because their ability to judge what you mean via your meta-communication is broken. That filter is effectively broken. So if we continue with I love you, you could say that in a lot of different ways. You say, oh fuck it, you know what, you're so fucking crazy, I love you. And they might be like, oh, do you mean that? Do you mean you actually love me? Because they can't distinguish the meta-communication. They can't accurately tell. And as I say, with jokes, they get confused. You could say that in a loving way, you could say it in an angry way, you could say that in a lustful way, but they wouldn't understand it, and they get frustrated, and they find themselves alienated. This is very often something that we see amongst people who are diagnosed as autistic as well. Often people who are autistic get the double diagnosis. They get schizophrenic, autistic, and they also struggle to deal with the meta-communication. I remember that one of the most classically autistic guy I've ever met. I'm not really in contact with him anymore. I was only in contact with him for a couple of months. Classically in like textbook, as in really, really poor with face-to-face communication, had amazing skills in other areas. He said that he couldn't like, I thought he had dreadful face-to-face communication skills, but he said that that was him at his best, and what he'd learned to do was he'd learned to do the opposite of what his mind was telling him to do. So he said in order to communicate with people socially, his every instinct in his body would, and in his mind and his neurology would tell him to do this, and he said basically he taught himself to do the opposite, and that gave him some kind of a foothold on being on socially acceptable communication and behaviour, which you know, you just imagine must be incredibly painful to do, really, really uncomfortable to do. The other areas, it's pretty dark, this is a pretty dark video, because double bind theory of schizophrenia is very, very useful, and I think it's vitally important that people understand how you could be being driven crazy and how a person could be driven crazy, and how propaganda and advertising very often puts us in double binds for a result, for an effect. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. That's a double bind, and there's pain that goes both ways, and you can't. Another level of double bind there is you can't question that, because you don't know George W. Bush. He says it to you on the TV. You can't turn around to the TV and go, hey, man on the TV, that's bullshit. You can't question it, because it's the Big Brother scenario, isn't it? He is simply telling you this is the way it is. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. The TV's not a two-way. Only in 1984 is the TV communicating with you, but in our world it's not. So you can't actually say anything back. And there is a positive aspect to these double binds, which I'll cover in another video. But finally, is the where you get abusers who will tell the children that they're abusing. This is the last bit of darkness, that they're either doing it for their own good, or they're doing it because they love them, or they're doing it because it's what the child wants. So the abuser actually says to the child, this is what you want. Again, that's a double bind. There is no way out, there is no escape from it. It's usually repeated, and every option equals pain. So the person eventually, the child eventually, their mind breaks. You know, they go insane. The anguish is too much, and they don't. You know, they grow up into people that doctors struggle to diagnose, and then they just rubber stamp them with this idea of being schizophrenic, which is a problem that is permanent, pervasive, and personal. Whereas Gregory Bateson's view, Gregory Bateson's idea, what I think is so beautiful about it, because it's organic and because it's environmental, it is not necessarily permanent. Because it's not genetic, because it's not a genetic fault or some biochemical imbalance or whatever bullshit juju, voodoo, fucking quack explanation they give nowadays before they hand out Prozac like fucking Smarties. Not that I'm going to get on a rant here. It's not personal. It's not permanent necessarily. It could be temporary. It's not personal. It's not because something is wrong with you. It's because something was wrong with the environment. And it's not necessarily pervasive. It doesn't have to be every single aspect of your personality is fucked. If I rubber stamp you, bang, you're schizophrenic. That's like what happened with people who've been put into abusive scenarios, either as children or as adults, is they're told by the abuser, this is your fault, this is what you want, this is what you need, this is good for you, I'm doing this for you, I'm beating the shit out of you for your own good. Even, you know, I'm beating the demons out of you, I'm beating the evil out of you, you're possessed, I have to keep torturing you until we get all the evil out. This is stuff that's happened, you know. I can point you to cases, if you'd like, where people have been beaten to death, tortured to death, in this context within the last 5 to 10 years. Pretty dark video, that. But it comes with a lot of hope, because I think if you can understand that, then you can understand any psychological problem within that context as being something that's environmental. When it comes to the notion of psychological issues being purely an issue of the environment, and the person I always like to point to is Zimbardo. He talks about the Lucifer effect. I'll get into that on a different video clip. I don't want to put too much into this video clip. But that's Gregory Bateson's double bind theory. I think it's very important that everybody understand that. It's important that people who do therapy or coaching work can have that level of understanding and compassion for their clients. And it's important that as individuals watching this who might have been victims of narcissists or might have been victims of abusers, that, you know, this is what's been done to you. And I think many of us who've been in shit relationships will have got to the point where we question our own sanity and we start to go, fucking, am I going crazy? Is this me? via the model of the double-bind theory of schizophrenia, we can see that there is actually a step-by-step process by which you can be driven crazy. And if you started to feel like you were going crazy, it wasn't a fault with your brain or a mental weakness with you. It's that if you're put through that scenario, if you're put through all 4 requirements of a double-bind, you will start to go mad. Where do you see that in bad relationships? It requires 2 or more people. It's not a one-off event, it's usually something that's repeated over and over and over again. There is a primary injunction, or a level of communication, that implies if you do or don't do it, then there will be pain. And then there is a secondary injunction, which directly contradicts the primary injunction, which also involves a massive amount of pain. And then you get to the damned if you do, damned if you don't. And you could say, but they don't have the power of life or death over you. Yes and no. I mean, if you're in a relationship and you're in love with somebody, and you know that the breaking up of that relationship is going to be massively painful, there are parts of your body and there are parts of your brain that don't know the difference between real reality and reality that's vividly imagined. And an emotional death, an emotional torture, an emotional upheaval can be just as frightening and can fire off as much adrenaline and as much terror as a real physical torture or a real physical upheaval. But those, again, are issues probably for another day. What's the happy side of this, Richie, I hear you ask? You see double binds being used effectively in Zen Buddhism. We'll get onto that in another video, to help people to enlighten themselves and to see the flaws in their own reasoning and in you know, the limitations of rationality and the limitations of logic. Nobody should ever fall in love with logic too deeply, I don't believe, or their own sense of rationality. And you also see in Ericksonian hypnosis, he puts people into positive double binds where, whether they like it or not, for no reason whatsoever, they just have to feel better about themselves, and he puts them into that double bind, and he uses the torturer's methodology to take people out of pain and into states of happiness where they have no choice but to feel better, which can only be a good thing. But we'll cover that in another video. I just wanted a real bare bones outline of what Gregory Bateson's double bind theory of schizophrenia was, and I think I've done that. So thank you. Got any questions, just let me know. So.